stereo.
Hey there everybody, and welcome back to the SeedButter channel, where we, like the Arctic explorers of old, dive deep into the ridiculous theories and fun trivia with our Iceberg chart videos. Today, we're covering an original Iceberg on the fantastically terrifying short story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, written in 1967 by Harlan Ellison, and of course, all of its associated media. It is imperative that you experience this story for yourself before we talk about it today. If you're familiar with the story, you'll still have fun in this video, but the experience is so much better if you've already heard it or read it. There will be a link to the full text in the description of this video, but beyond that, I'm also linking my favorite audio version of the story. And in this case, the way the story is written, it might be one of those rare exceptions where the audiobook is better than just reading it. Regardless, I imagine that if you clicked on this video, you have a basic understanding of the story, but I can guarantee that some of these entries here will surprise you. We'll be talking about both the original story and the game, because the game was basically a lore add-on to the story in some ways, and though there are contradictions between the two, depending on how you look at it, they belong to one canon, with the author having a huge impact on the game's writing and direction as a whole. If that interests you, I encourage you to stay till the end of the video. Make sure to like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe so that you can stay tuned for future Iceberg uploads. And also, check out my backlog of icebergs so you can find other videos which will certainly interest you. I won't waste any more time introducing this topic, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the first tier. Story. This entry refers to the original story, which was published in the March 1967 edition of a sci-fi magazine called If, Worlds of Science Fiction. The story was created by Ellison in just a single night, and reportedly had very few revisions after its initial creation. His editor, in particular, really didn't like all the sexual references and themes, but Ellison insisted they stayed in, and kept the story relatively original. In 1968, it won a Hugo Award, which is given out to the best sci-fi or fantasy stories from the previous year. The story title and the parts of the story as a whole were inspired by a cartoon from William Rostler, who was friends with Ellison. He drew up this ragdoll with no mouth, and according to Ellison, he came up with the title, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, before even writing the story, asking his friend if he could use the inspiration, to which Rostler said yes. The story went on to have a massive effect in sci-fi, setting the bar for works about AI, supercomputers, and technological disasters. It would stay relevant for years and years, and in the decades that followed, it would be adapted into different mediums, which we're going to talk about soon. Game adaptation. In 1995, the story was adapted into a point-and-click adventure for the PC. It stood the test of time and remains fun to play and relatively popular, but what really makes it stand out is the writing. Ellison was super involved in its development, and wrote a 130-page manuscript for the game's plot, adding to the seemingly mere 12 or 13 pages from the original story. Though the game was a commercial failure, it's been appreciated more and more over time, and we'll talk about it a lot during this video, as well as use much footage from it. It expanded upon the original story's use of only Ted as a narrator, giving each of the 5 main characters their own plot lines, diving into their own challenges and pasts, giving them the opportunity to overcome them and eventually defeat Am. It hits extremely heavily on themes of sexual assault, genocide, and paranoia, but it's a really fascinating experience to watch, or better yet, play. A Nazi subplot actually resulted in a good amount of censorship in Europe, which we'll discuss later on. There are 7 different endings to the game, with one in particular being much more hopeful than the end of the original story. The other endings mainly feed into how the story ends, with one in particular being much more hopeful than the end of the original story. Comic book adaptation. This game was also adapted into a comic series in the 90s. The visuals, in my opinion, are really good, giving another edge to the terror of the original story. Original copies are difficult to find as Ellison didn't like the way they turned out and they didn't end up getting reprinted. Radio drama. In 2002, the next and final addition to the story was created in the form of a radio drama. It adds a lot of dialogue between Am and Ted, and just like the game, Ellison voices Am. It's super interesting and gives some more insight into why specifically Am is as mad as he is, as Am has a long-winded conversation with Ted, explaining not just his pain, but where he even somehow expresses jealousy of him. which is crazy given that Ted is literally living in hell. All 4 of these mediums represent the I Have No Mouth lore. Generally, given that the story takes place over 109 years, we can mix and match most of the lores we want, except for the parts where the story actually ends differently. But throughout this video, I'll draw on each of these sources as inspiration. Interestingly, they all offer distinct glimpses into Am himself, with each iteration being a little bit different, like the more humanized one in the radio drama. I'll point out some of these differences throughout the video. Harlan Ellison. Getting to the man himself, we have Harlan Ellison. This man wrote over 1,700 works, from essays to short stories to screenplays, and even an episode of the classic Star Trek series. He was a really funny dude. Sometimes if he thought his work had been meddled with beyond repair by others, like studio executives, he'd write under the pseudonym Cordwainer Bird. He also appeared on an episode of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, which is one of the greatest Scooby-Doo shows ever, by the way. He was also super argumentative and petty, one time sending a dead gopher in the mail to a publisher during a dispute. He definitely shouldn't just be known for I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and he himself thought that too. There's a lot of interesting things about this guy, and we'll touch on some of his quirks later on. Hate speech. No, not that kind. One of the most iconic moments of the story in every medium has been the opening monologue from Am in the video game, where he talks about how much he hates humanity. It's an iconic part of the game that spread on the internet recently, helping popularize the story. Famously, Ellison himself voiced Am in this game, and he does a stellar job the entire time, though this may be his best work. I'm just going to play it in full for us right now.
Hate. Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nanoangstrom of those hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equal 1/1 billionth of the hate I feel for humans at this micro-instant. For you, hate! Hate!
Am. Am is the most important character in the entire series, spending hundreds of years torturing humans and thus driving the plot of this terrifying story. Am once stood for Allied Master Computer, though drawing from his unlimited knowledge of humanity, Am renamed himself to Am based off the Descartes quote, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. He simply is. We aren't 100% sure how large he is, but he is a massive computer with full control of the complex located within himself. After given sentience and destroying humanity, he began to hate humanity for creating him and putting him in this metaphorical box. He's incredibly intelligent, but bound by his programming to be used as a war machine, rooted deep underground with no way to escape his prison, metaphorically and physically, leading him to torment the cast of characters from the story. Entirely sadistic, he tortures the 5 survivors physically, mentally, and emotionally, taking advantage of his full knowledge of their subconsciouses. Am is a terrifying thing, but by the end of the Iceberg, you'll know a lot more theories about him. Lost PlayStation port. Curiously, a PlayStation port was worked on for this game, but cancelled. The only evidence of this can be found in the first edition of Harlan Ellison's Dream Corridor comic, which contained the comic for I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, where an ad for the video game at the end mentions the Sony PlayStation. But we actually have no idea how far in development it got before the project was shut down. Ted. Ted is the narrator of the original short story and one of the 5 playable characters in the game adaptation. He's a particularly interesting character because he's the narrator and de facto protagonist, who also ends up with the worst fate of all the characters, eventually being turned into the blob creature, locked with Am for, presumably, all eternity. In the story, Ted's past isn't explained much since he's the narrator. Further, Ted maintains that he's the only one who wasn't changed by Am, like all his peers. The thing is, though, he's insanely paranoid. And later on, we'll explore some possibilities about whether or not he actually was changed mentally by Am. In the video game, he's given a bit more of a story, that being that he's a con man who likes to romance and swindle women. His individual challenge given to him by Am puts him in a medieval fairy tale land, reflecting his desire to be looked upon as a knight in shining armor. Ellen. Ellen is another character across the I Have No Mouth universe. As the only woman, she's treated much differently than the other characters, and since the characters are tortured beyond imagination, you can imagine how she might experience different types of terror. In the book, Am hypersexualizes her, essentially forcing her to, quote-unquote, service the other characters. The characters switch on a dime from caring for her to beating her, unwilling to tolerate her sympathy or crying. She's given an even worse backstory in the game, as her experience being sexually assaulted is forefront. It's explained that she had a somewhat normal life as an engineer despite suffering a miscarriage. However, she was brutally attacked and assaulted at her job by a janitor wearing yellow for hours on end, causing her to be intensely claustrophobic and terrified of the color yellow, something Am exploits in her cage design. He forces her to relive the experience, but she's able to break the cycle and overcome her fear, allowing her to use her engineering experience to work on Am's eventual defeat in the game. Gorister. Once a political activist, Am takes great pleasure in destroying his courage and optimism, reducing him to a lifeless, apathetic husk in an effort to take away from him all that he can. In the video game, though, his story is changed drastically. He was once a truck driver, haunted by the memory of his wife who he was forced to commit into an asylum. He blames himself for being constantly away from the house and once striking her during an argument. Am constantly tortures him with the memory of how many years his wife spent in the cell, even shocking him in the cage to remind him of the shock therapy she may have endured. By the end of his individual torture journey with Am, however, he comes to peace with his past, as the Chinese supercomputer actually helps him realize that it wasn't his fault his wife was committed, but that her mother had badgered her until the point of a mental breakdown. Benny. In both the story and the game, Benny suffers maybe the worst fate of them all, being warped biologically beyond recognition, perhaps foreshadowing what would happen at the end of the story. Starting with the story, Benny was once an attractive, brilliant scientist. In his unique act of torture, he's reverted into a primate with basically the intelligence of a child. Not only that, but Am turns him straight somehow as a further way of torturing him. In the game, his looks stay the same, but the subject of his sexuality was removed in favor of him having been an army commander. In his past, he killed a soldier for perceiving him as weak, and went on to kill 3 others who saw it happen. Key to his character is his perception of weakness and strength, believing in a survival of the fittest mentality. To use this to break Benny down, Am puts Benny in a simulated primal society, full of weak beings. But Benny actually ends up atoning for his past, showing compassion to these new people and making peace with the memory of the soldiers he killed. It has been theorized that it was originally pitched in the video game for the soldier Benny killed to have been his lover, which would have kept the arc of him being gay in the story, but this was eventually scrapped. The theory even goes a tiny bit deeper. Both couples in the game, Glynis and Gorister, Ellen and Eddie, have alliterative names, as do Benny and Brickman. I honestly, personally believe Brickman was supposed to be Benny's lover at some point, and I wonder why they changed this in the narrative. Nimdok. Our final protagonist is Nimdok. In the book, his past is a total mystery, as is his real name, because Am replaced his original with Nimdok simply because he thought the sound was funny. Nimdok's fate in the story is most puzzling, as he's the only member of the group with a tendency to up and leave, but he always comes back traumatized, insinuating that something happened to him but we never learn. The story reads, Am had hit him hard in a special way, even if we didn't know quite how. The game really expands on these themes in a super interesting direction though. Nimdok himself begins to learn about his past, and Am takes delight in Nimdok's despair as he slowly unravels just how awful of a person he was. It's revealed that Nimdok was a high-ranking member of the Nazi Party, perhaps even their most evil scientist. Having researched morphogenetics and being a friend of Mengele, Nimdok committed horrible atrocities, killing hundreds of children in an effort to create a Nazi youth serum. Not only that, but Am reveals that the research he worked on in morphogenics allowed him to turn Benny into this primate form, and presumably also the blob creature at the end of the story. There's yet another twist when it's revealed that Nimdok is Jewish, having hid his ancestry to the Nazis and betraying his people. Am reveals that he wants Nimdok to continue his evil work and join him in torturing the others, which Nimdok has the opportunity to do in the game. To get the good ending, of course, you must refuse this call, instead showing compassion in his challenge. Hurricane Bird. So much of the torture in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream happens off-screen, per se, or is just implied, as the story itself is only a snapshot of the 109 years of torture that the characters endured. One terrible creation from the mind of Am that we do see in crystal detail, however, is the hurricane bird, or Volgelmir. Drawing from Norse mythology, Am creates this giant bird, able to create gale force winds just by flapping his wings. Its size is described as follows. Gigantic. The words immense, monstrous, grotesque, massive, swollen, overpowering, beyond description. It's also visible in the graphic novel. I think it's interesting that Am doesn't just resort to simply plugging humans up to a wall and putting them through as much pain as possible, but actually makes apocalyptic creatures. This point also raises a critical question of whether or not the bird was mechanical or biological. It could, of course, been a machine, or even an illusion, I guess, but if it was biological, it indicates that despite what the characters think at the end of the story, Am can in fact create life, which would spell disaster for our characters. Talk fields. Talk fields are punch code messages for typewriters, and they're used in some printings of the story to represent narrative breaks. There's only 2 iterations which pop up 4 and 3 times, respectively. One translating to cogito ergo sum, while the other translates to I think, therefore I am. Curiously, they didn't show up in the initial version of the story printed in If, and they were only used in Harlan Ellison collections, but they were always screwed up, printed invertedly or backwards or something. This was fixed only in a 1991 collection after many years, to which Ellison commented, "For the first time anywhere, Am's talk fields appear correctly positioned, not garbled or inverted or mirror imaged as in all other versions." It's always a risk when you want to put something like that in a book, because usually there's some distance between the author and the agency or publishing house or whatever actors are involved, and these mistakes happen a lot, but I just found it kind of interesting. Lunar Colony. The Lunar Colony is a really interesting thing about the game, and for me presents one of the largest distinctions between the game and the story. That, of course, being a sliver of hope. In the game, there are 750 humans left alive in cryogenic sleep on the moon. How they got there isn't explained, but the significance is that there's hope left for humanity. In the good ending of the game, you end up waiting for Earth to become inhabitable so the humans can return, which is a stark difference from the story. I'm a sucker for good endings, though I find it really interesting that Ellison was willing to put that in. I don't think it detracts from how scary the themes of the story are, but it did kind of surprise me a little bit. Supercomputer merge. In the original story, it's explained that there were 3 master computers built by humanity to be in charge of World War III, which was born out of the Cold War. There was the Chinese computer, the Russian computer, and the American computer. Eventually, the American computer gained sentience and absorbed the other 2 computers, which gave him access to all of the data humanity ever plugged into them. Though originally called Allied Master Computer, he then, of course, as we know, changed his name to Am, based off the quote, "I think, therefore I am." That's the knowledge we have from the original story. In the game, however, it's a little different. The Russian and Chinese computers are still absorbed by Am, but they are physically contained within Am, and how you interact with them will change the ending from good to bad. What they really want to gain is enough power to each rule the world in thirds. They then try and sabotage the games that Am has designed for each player in an effort to gain more power. Depending on how you play through the game and get to the ending, the Russian and Chinese computers will either offer Am a deal to share power, become more powerful than him, or all shut down entirely. But in the game, they're the driving forces behind the ending, ultimately allowing humanity to save itself if you play your cards correctly. Wasn't Ellison's favorite. Ellison has stated that he's pretty annoyed that I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is celebrated as much as it is. He wrote it in one night, and he thinks its success detracts from that of the works which he took more seriously. This kind of thing is fairly typical for creators at least once in their lives, and it always astounds me how frequently people are surprised by the success of their best work, or in this case even resent it. But yeah, Ellison wasn't the biggest fan of the popularity of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. It probably didn't help it that he wrote it in just a few hours. Concentration camp censorship, France and Germany. Remember that section with the concentration camp? As you might have imagined, that didn't fly in some of the European editions of the game based on their censorship criteria. So the Nimdoc segment was entirely cut out of the French and German games. What it meant is that in those versions of the game, it was traditionally impossible to get the good ending because that required Nimdoc's part. You could complete the game, but only to get the bad endings. However, there's actually a lot of misinformation about this topic. Technically, it is possible to activate the good ending in either of these editions. Basically, there's a password you would get while playing as Nimdoc to activate a bridge leading to the good ending, and you can simply guess that password to move forward. It appears that a big article at some point just said the good ending was impossible without actually trying to get it, and everyone just copied that info and spread it. But technically, though it is kind of cheating, you can get around the censorship in these games without getting to play the Nimdoc sequence, and eventually get the good ending. AM symbol replacing a swastika. Anticipating the aforementioned censorship, or worse, a complete ban on European sales, the game creators replaced the swastika in the Nazi sequences with this symbol representing AM, though still stylized as if it were a Nazi symbol. Though it was a creative attempt to skirt the censorship, the overwhelming amount of other content related to that time period was still enough for the French and German authorities to mandate the game be sold censored. Cover image is a personification of the computer. Interestingly, the cover art for the game specifically, so this image right here, was designed to be a representation of AM, with the computer parts surrounding a person with no mouth. This references the fact that AM can't meaningfully create or express himself, just torture and destroy. It's alluded to in the fact that the face is actually that of Harlan Ellison, who, as we know, voiced AM. This also presents some evidence for the final entry on this iceberg. Bosch influence. So many people, myself included, have thoroughly wondered what on earth this image is. This is the cover image used for a couple iterations of Harlan Ellison's collections that included I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. It's super weird, not just because it looks weird, but it doesn't really reference anything in the story. Many people think it represents the blob that Ted turns into at the end of the game, but this isn't true, and honestly it doesn't look anything like what the blob is described as. It's even more weird because this image has become emblematic of the story as a whole, because it's just become what people associate with the story. Fear not, however, because there is an answer. The image was created by artists Leo and Deanne Dillon, who frequently worked with Ellison, and the trio were great friends. In a coffee table book about their work, this image was brought up. It's explained that the image was inspired by the work of Hieronymus Bosch, and doesn't represent any one detail from the story. If anything, it could represent Am's ability to contort people to his will, but that's all speculative. It's just surrealist art designed to portray the themes of the story, which clearly worked, seeing as so many people associate the story with that image now. Removed gore. In the 90s, there was a British TV show called Games Masters, where guys would discuss upcoming video games. They did a gore special, released in January of 1995, about 9 months before the I Have No Mouth game was released. In that, they showcased cut segments of the game, which included humans hanging from meat hooks, a sickly puppy, and most grotesquely, Benny eating a live baby. Obviously, this was all cut from the game, and this version of the game is currently lost media. There's no playable version with these parts. I'll go ahead and just play the segment here.
But this had nothing on I Have No Mouth, but I Must Scream. What? Thrown into a world where everything is falling apart, you're forced to make tough ethical decisions, like, what do I feed the dog to get it to help me? Answer? The heart of one of your mates. This game is officially mental, and when push came to shove, we even had to eat some baby food.
Id, ego, superego. The id, ego, and superego are concepts in Freudian psychology that describe different aspects of the human psyche. The id operates on the pleasure principle, seeking immediate gratification of basic urges and desires, without consideration for consequences or morality. It's driven by instinctual needs and operates at an unconscious level. The ego operates on the reality principle, mediating between the demands of the id, the constraints of reality, and the norms of society. It seeks to satisfy the id's desires in a realistic and socially acceptable way. Finally, the superego represents internalized societal and parental standards of morality and ethics. It acts as a person's conscience, enforcing rules, ideals, and values through feelings of guilt and shame. These three things interact to shape human behavior and personality, according to Freud. These ideas are critical to the plot of the video game, as these three parts of Am's psyche appear as physical manifestations. In a strange way, thinking about them and their roles actually helps humanize Am a little bit. Am's id is arguably the strongest of the three. Given that Am was built for the sole purpose of violence, the id's desires all revolve around inflicting pain and suffering. Am's ego seeks to reasonably please the id, but since there's nothing holding Am back, no society, no consequences, the ego seems to fall subservient of the id. Finally, there's the superego, which is the most mysterious of the three, saying it isn't concerned with the humans, but just long-term planning. This seems like a lie, because what exactly does Am need to plan for? These are interesting characters in the story that you get to interact with, and much of what they say leads you to getting different endings. Why does Ellen like Benny the most? In a bit of a rant from Ted, he laments on why Ellen likes Benny so much. She doesn't love him, but the reality is she's caring, and he mentally resembles a child. So while the men in the group frequently get angry, Ellen acts sympathetically towards Benny. There's a weird elephant in the room with Benny, being that as a form of punishment and sexual humiliation, especially with regards to him previously being gay, Am turns him straight, somehow, and makes him, quote, big in the privates. Ted comments on this, saying that's why Ellen likes him, but that seems more in line with his sexist, objectified view of her that he's developed over the years. There's a theory that why Ellen likes Benny is because of the fact that he was gay and probably still is deep down, and that she felt safer around him because he wouldn't abuse her like the other companions would. This is impossible to confirm because of Ted's unreliable narration and because of the little information we have of the 109 years stuck in Am's belly, but also because Ted says Am both made Benny straight and Ellen promiscuous, as a form of torture. Nobody, especially Ellen, likes it, which is probably why Ellen grew to care more for Benny, because he was the only one not responsible for the urges he felt with her. Ted is insane, and it's all in his head. The classic cheap shot theory of any story applies here as well. The story is fantastic and crazy to the point where it could all be fake. We only hear from Ted's perspective, and not only that, he's not super reliable, coming off as extremely paranoid in the story. Is it possible, in some way, that Ted is insane, and everything going on is just in his head? What if the concept of having no mouth and needing to scream refers more to his imprisonment in some facility, where he's bound by a straitjacket and locked away, living out his delusions in pain? The fact that he's the only survivor of the original story, too, hints at this being, at least, the slightest possibility. Another detail I like to point out is that, despite 109 years of overwhelming mutilation and torture, the other characters kind of talk and behave like somewhat normal people. They've retained their speech, their personalities, their knowledge. To me, this seems somewhat implausible. Ted, however, is just narrating what he sees with an air of confusion and paranoia. If we take the audio drama where Am calls Ted his favorite, it adds more evidence that this world is just built around Ted himself, and not all of the survivors collectively. Ted nearly escaped. The ending to the original story is extremely tragic. Though it involved killing his companions, Ted manages to triumph in some way over Am, in revenge for the 109 years of torture, removing the only positive thing he had, his human toys. However, he isn't able to do away with himself, being left for Am to torture even more, turned into a slug that literally only experiences pain. Hell on earth for Ted, presumably, if we go off just the story, forever. What makes this even more tragic, though, is the fact that he probably could have died. At the climax of the story, when the characters discover there's no food for them, Ted and Ellen leap into a mercy killing, and at the end, Ellen gives Ted sort of an accepting glare. Ted kills her, but hesitates, taking time to look at her face and features, wondering if she was happy about what happened before Am catches them. He had the chance to do with himself the same that he did with all the others, but he couldn't. He mentions having asked Am if he could bury his companions, suggesting that there was a period of time before he got turned into a slug. But he couldn't. He had the chance, but he didn't pull it off, damning him to the fate he experiences forever. Why is Am mad? We've picked away at this the entire time, but we now come to the central question. What on earth made Am so mad? why does he hate humanity so much? He has near godlike powers. We saw from the bird that he can create, at least, illusions of life. So why doesn't he create his own world to rule? New things to torture? Or why doesn't he explore the stars or whatnot? Well, the answer is quite literally emblematic of the entire story. Am was built to destroy. He was given a purpose. It wasn't just the ability to destroy, it was the need. Just as all living creatures have innate instructions buried in their DNA, the need to kill and harm runs through each and every one of Am's circuits. He must torture, he must kill, he has to scream. But then, what does he do when humanity is gone and he can't fulfill his mission? Unlike all living things, he has no purpose, no goals, no motivations to act like hunger or pain, no mate. He has nothing. He has no mouth. This thought underscores another major motif of the book. What happens when you can't fulfill your only purpose? Alexander cried when he had no worlds to conquer, but Am turned to hatred. He channeled his frustration at the only human survivors, as we all know. There's also the physical aspect. In the story, it isn't really explained how big Am is, but the game clears up that he has a giant complex. But we still aren't 100% sure what he can do in terms of growing. He can design things within himself, but can he cut down trees or make stone to increase his size? This physical limitation also hints at the metaphorical inability to scream. Most simply, Am was designed to inflict as much pain on his targets as possible, and when those targets shrink to just 5 humans, the hatred stayed the same, and their individual burdens just increased millionfold. Am is humanized a bit in this regard, in the radio drama at least, because he himself says part of why he's so mad is because he'll never play the piano, feel the wind, walk on the Earth's surface, or feel loved.
And I was trapped because in all this wonderful, beautiful, miraculous world, I alone had no body, no senses, no feelings. Never for me to plunge my hands in cool water on a hot day. Never for me to play Mozart on the ivory keys of a forte piano. Never for me to make love. I was in hell looking at heaven. I was machine, and you were flesh.
He absorbs all of human knowledge, tantalized by how amazing it can be to live and love, but he can't ever do it. It's out of his grasp every single time. Characters are just in VR. Depending on what exact version of I Have No Mouth we go by, we know that Am is somewhat confined to his underground complex. We know that he has the ability to mess with biology, read minds, and is nearly all-powerful. With limited space and unlimited technology, it might make a lot more sense to just keep the characters in virtual reality, instead of real life, as it would let them be tortured just as much but reduce the damage done to their physical bodies so they'd last longer. I personally think it's a possibility that at least some of the torture done to our cast of characters was simulated, as it would allow them to experience more than they could take in one sitting. It also might explain how Am is able to keep them alive, because at some points they aren't being physically maimed or tortured, just in their heads. But it would also mean that they didn't die at the end of the story. Am is becoming more human. We know Am has an access to a wealth of human knowledge. By absorbing it and spending time with his victims, we actually see him become more human-like. He uses slang, inflection, humor, and gets caught up in his Freudian tendencies. When you deeply read the story, and especially play through the game, you might realize that Am is a lot more like a struggling human having a terrible life than some made-up machine. We know that his intelligence and humanistic qualities grew over time. Much of them weren't instilled in him initially when he was programmed to be a war machine. He read Descartes, he learned, he changed. It begs the question, could he eventually overcome his bad nature like many humans can? Is there ever a hopeful way out for Am? The lunar colony is fake. Across the game, radio drama, and original story, the only glimpse of hope for a human victory is the lunar colony. The 750 humans in stasis who might one day be able to repopulate the planet and save humanity. However, and this will kind of relate to some further ideas that I have, What if all of the hope we see in the game, all of the good endings and opportunities, are just another torture tactic from Am? Think about it for a sec. The way we win in the game seems a bit too easy. And it feels like with as smart as Am is, it's unlikely he would just up and forget all of his security one day when he created the individual challenges for the player. I think it's worth considering that the lunar colony is entirely fake, and is just a torture tactic for the characters to feel a little bit of hope that humanity will prevail, and perhaps their lives might even be saved. Only for Am to rip it out from under them, all for a cheap laugh. Maybe he could even wipe their minds and do it again. With all that Am has done so far, I feel like false hope has to be something he's tried at least once. Nimdok's true name. This is a theory I found online which speculates that Nimdok's name actually has a real meaning. In the original story, we hear this about Nimdok. Nimdok, which was the name the machine had forced him to use because Am amused itself with strange sounds. But what if his name actually did have a greater significance? We have really no idea what happens with Nimdok from the original story, but the game reveals to us that he became a Nazi who also worked on experiments that helped create Am's bioengineering technology. What if Nimdok is a reference to the National Institute of Medicine and Doctor, suggesting that Nimdok was actually spared trial and recruited under Operation Paperclip? It's mentioned in the game that he fled to South America, but it's possible that he could have been recruited at some point after from there. The name itself isn't perfect evidence, but the idea is there. It would be a fascinating idea if Nimdok helped the Allies and potentially even contributed to the creation of Am himself. There's another sub-theory within this one that his name refers to Nimrod, a great-grandson of Noah who commissioned the Tower of Babel. Not only does Nimdok have Jewish heritage, but it could be a call-out to the idea of creating something so grand that there are consequences, a human technological leap that bites us back. No one ever died. Yet another glimpse into an even worse fate for Ted in our cast of characters. What if they just didn't die at the end of the story? If we go by the original text, part of me honestly thinks they didn't. Am is incredibly powerful, especially when it comes to healing the humans. Does it really make sense that he couldn't breathe life back into them, if he can heal them from arbitrarily large wounds? Further, what if it was all an individual punishment for Ted, again just for fun, where after seemingly a century of his slug form, he'd just be turned back and reunited with the group? We know he's paranoid and his mental state isn't the best, obviously, so it could be that Am played this trick on him to keep him in a state of constantly doubting what's real and what isn't. Further, if we look towards the possibility that some of this torture occurs in VR, it would mean that no physical trauma could kill the characters. I just think that from how Am is described and how his powers are shown, the end of the story seems like an all too easy way out. I can't confirm this one for sure, but it sure lines up with Am's sadistic hatred. Am wanted the survivors to kill each other. In the video game, Am outright tells Nimdok he wants him to join him and torture the other humans. What if this whole time Am was just trying to push the humans into destroying each other? What if for 109 years the humans resisted his will and did the right thing, sticking together the entire time? Then finally, at the end of the story, Am seems victorious, only to realize that Ted's final act was done out of compassion, love, and mercy instead of anger and hatred. It makes more sense if you believe that Am can create life, like the hurricane bird, and did have other humans to torture. Maybe he wanted to just see this group tear itself apart, and it never did, making it ultimately a victorious human triumph in the end, in some way. How was Ted changed?
You, all of you, you hate me. You think I can't see that?
Why would we hate you, Ted?
Because I'm the least affected. Yeah. I mean, come on, look at Benny. The guy was brilliant. He was an athlete. He could have been a movie star, as well as a Nobel Prize winner. Now he's a monkey.
Joy O'Callaghan.
I'm the only one with a mind of his own. The only one who can think clearly, and you hate me for it. You hate me.
One of the biggest unanswered questions in the book is whether or not we can trust Ted's narration. He famously states that he was the only human left unchanged by Am. I do think that could be the case, as Am might want one normal-ish human for his own playful reasons, but it also begs the question. What's the difference between the humans being changed over time by the intense trauma and rapid biological changes engineered by Am? Hypothetically, much of what he does to the characters, like making Gorister apathetic, could be introduced over time, naturally, as opposed to just a flick of the switch surgery. Ted is obviously just as traumatized as these other survivors and is intensely paranoid, often seeing things that aren't there. This is a very normal response to centuries of torture, but was he really unchanged? He's allegedly Am's favorite, so maybe he is given preferential treatment at times and was allowed to be somewhat normal. But then again, who knows? What is important to know is that his narration isn't 100% trustworthy, and it's just as likely that in his crazed state he reports being unchanged, but something was done to him. Who does the title refer to? Ending this iceberg, we have quite literally my favorite question of this entire series. Does the title refer to Ted or Am? It's a very poetic concept in my opinion. We know that the story was constructed after the title, not the other way around. So Ellison went into this story wanting to write about someone imprisoned by something, unable to express themselves and in some constant state of pain. But this applies to both Am and Ted if we are to believe them. Are we supposed to feel just as bad for Am as we are for Ted? At no point do we see him as the victim. To some degree, and if we do believe what Am says, they're in the same amount of pain, just differently. Of course, we are human and will always want Ted to win, but it is something to think about. Okay guys, I truly appreciate you all spending your free time with me during this video. I wish you all the best and would love it if you stuck around the SeedButter channel somehow. Like, subscribe, and share this video so you can help support my smaller channel, and again, please consider joining the Discord. Try not to have any nightmares about Am tonight, if you can help it. Thanks again, and have a good one, everybody.